Hospitals at night are their own kind of haunted. Not in the Hollywood sense, not with flickering lights or doors slamming shut by themselves, but in the way the silence stretches too long, the way the air feels too still. It settles into your bones, that feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of your vision. You tell yourself it's exhaustion, the monotony of endless shifts and blinking monitors, but deep down, a part of you knows this place is full of ghosts. I had been working the night shift at St. Augustine General Hospital for the better part of 6 years. Long enough to know that things happen in hospitals that can't be explained. Long enough to hear the whispered stories passed between nurses over burnt coffee at 3 in the morning. But I never thought I'd become part of one. It was a slow night. Those were the worst, when the quiet settled like a heavy fog over the ward, making every creak of the floor and every distant beep of a monitor sound louder than it should. I was making my rounds when I stopped outside room 219, Mr. Wallace's room. Samuel Wallace, 79 years old, comatose for the last 3 weeks following a severe stroke. He was one of those patients you see every night, check his vitals, update his chart, and move on. The family had long since said their goodbyes, and we all knew it was only a matter of time. Death was just waiting in the wings. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room smelled like antiseptic and something else, something stale like the breath of someone who hadn't spoken in years. The only sound was the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. I glanced at his chart, then at the man himself, expecting to see the same motionless form I had seen for weeks. Instead, his eyes were open. My stomach tightened. His gaze wasn't just open, it was alert, sharp, too aware for someone who had been unresponsive for so long. His pupils reflected the dim light from the hallway, giving them an almost glassy, otherworldly sheen. "Mr. Wallace?" I kept my voice steady, but my fingers tightened around the clipboard. This wasn't supposed to happen. His head turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge me. His lips were dry, cracked. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but clear. "She's leaving us tonight." A chill crept up my spine. "Who?" I asked before I could stop myself. His eyes drifted past me, toward the ceiling. A slow, almost serene smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "She's here." I turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the hallway was empty, just the pale glow of overhead lights stretching into the distance. I swallowed hard and looked back at Mr. Wallace. His expression hadn't changed, his gaze locked on something just beyond my perception. It was then that I noticed his monitors had begun to slow, his breathing was deeper, heavier, as though whatever energy had jolted him awake was draining away. I did a quick vitals check. Everything was steady, no immediate distress, but my gut told me something was wrong. "I'll be right back, Mr. Wallace," I said, though I doubted he could hear me anymore. I left the room, shaking off the creeping unease as I headed back to the nurse's station. Linda, the head nurse, was flipping through a stack of charts. A styrofoam cup of coffee balanced precariously on the edge of the desk. "Hey, Linda," I kept my tone light, casual. "Has Mr. Wallace ever been lucid before?" She raised an eyebrow. "Wallace? No. He's been out since the day he got here. Why?" I hesitated, then said, "He was awake just now, spoke to me, said something weird." That got her attention. She set the charts down, her frown deepening. "What did he say?" "She's leaving us tonight," I repeated, and the words felt even stranger on my tongue the second time. Then he said, "She's here." Linda's face paled slightly. She glanced down the hall toward his room. "You're not the first one to mention something like that," she murmured. I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" She lowered her voice. "It happens sometimes. Patients, right before they go, they say things, like they know. Some of them talk about seeing someone in the room with them, someone waiting." A cold weight settled in my chest. I had heard the stories before. Every doctor had. Patients waking from comas just long enough to say goodbye, murmuring about visitors no one else could see. But this wasn't some vague, poetic last moment. Mr. Wallace had been sure. He had been awake, aware. I spent the rest of my shift trying to shake the unease, but it clung to me like a shadow. I checked on my other patients, buried myself in paperwork, did everything I could to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Then at 3:14 a.m., the monitor alarm in room 218, the room next to Wallace's, went off. I rushed down the hall, heart pounding. The door was ajar, the dim light spilling into the hallway. Inside, the air was heavy, thick, like a presence still lingered. Mrs. Delacroix, the woman in 218, was dead. She had been stable, no signs of distress, no warnings. Her body was still warm, as if she had passed only moments ago. I stared at her, my pulse hammering in my ears. "She's leaving us tonight." I turned toward room 219, Master Wallace's room. His monitor was still beeping, steady as ever, but he was different now. His face was slack, his expression blank, his body as lifeless as before. The energy, the eerie awareness that had filled his eyes just hours ago was completely gone. I stepped back into the hall, my skin crawling. Had he known? Had he felt it? Or had something else been in that room with him? I never spoke to Mr. Wallace about that night again. Neither did he. When he was discharged a few days later, somehow still clinging to life, he never mentioned what he had seen, but every time I pass room 218, I remember his words, "She's leaving us tonight," and I wonder who will be next. I didn't talk about Mr. Wallace for a long time. Not to the other doctors, not to the nurses, not even to myself, if I could help it. But the memory of that night never left me. It stayed with me like an old wound that never quite healed, itching beneath the surface of my mind. I stopped walking past room 218 if I didn't have to. I never checked the patient logs to see who occupied it after Mrs. Delacroix. And I made sure, as best I could, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever it was that Mr. Wallace had seen. I thought I could leave it behind. But the thing about hospitals is, the longer you stay, the more you realize that these places collect things. Not just the living, but something else. Something that lingers, something that waits. You don't always see it, but you feel it in the empty halls, in the too cold air of an abandoned room, in the moments of silence that stretch too long. It was months later when I heard about Brightmoor Medical Center. A quiet little hospital in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. A friend of mine, Dr. Miriam Klein, had taken a position there after leaving St. Augustine. One night, over a rare shared meal, she told me about a patient she had who refused to sleep. "She says there's something in the hallway," Miriam said, stirring her tea absently. "Says it watches her every night." Something in the way she said it made me pause. What does she mean by something? Miriam shrugged, but her voice was tight. "I don't know. A shadow," she says. "A tall, dark figure that stands outside her room at night." She hesitated, then added, "She says it doesn't move like a person should." A slow chill crept over me. I thought about the way Mr. Wallace's eyes had shifted past me, the way he had whispered about someone who was here. The same thing? No. That was impossible. And yet, I found myself thinking about it more than I wanted to. The way Miriam's fingers had trembled slightly around her cup. The way her usual easy confidence had been replaced with something else. A kind of weariness. A weight. The patient she was talking about was Jenna Barnes, 47 years old, admitted for a routine gallbladder surgery. Nothing complicated. Nothing that should have led to nights spent wide awake in fear. Her trouble had started on her second night post-op. She had been drifting in and out of sleep, that foggy, half-conscious state where every sound feels too loud and every shadow looks like something else. That was when she heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, dragging. She had opened her eyes and stared at the dim rectangle of light beneath her hospital door. At first, it had seemed normal. Nurses and doctors moved around at all hours, but the longer she watched, the more she noticed something off. The shadow that appeared in the light, it was too tall, too still. It didn't move like a person's shadow should, it just stood there, watching. The first night, she told herself she was imagining things. The second night, she kept her eyes open, heart hammering as she stared at the door, waiting. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the shadow reappeared. This time, it moved, shifting almost imperceptibly. but not like a person would. Not a step forward, not a lean to the side. It was something else. A slithering, a stretching. Jenna had felt frozen in place, trapped in her own skin, as if she wasn't even inside her own body anymore. The figure never entered her room. It never knocked. But it was there. And it knew she was watching. She had told the nurses the next morning, but they had waved it off, saying it was probably a staff member on rounds. Maybe an orderly taking a late-night walk, maybe a side effect of the pain meds. Jenna knew better. On the third night, she decided to test it. She lay perfectly still in bed, pretending to be asleep, but watching through slitted eyes as the light from the hallway stretched across the floor. 3:07 a.m., the shadow arrived. This time it moved toward the door of the patient across the hall. Jenna's pulse pounded in her ears as she watched the inky shape slide beneath the doorframe, disappearing into the darkened room beyond. She wanted to scream, wanted to get up, wanted to run, but she did nothing. She couldn't. And in the morning, she found out the patient in that room had died during the night. A nurse told her it had been peaceful, that he had gone in his sleep. Jenna had nodded, lips pressed together, pretending she believed them. But deep down she knew the truth. She had seen it happen. She had seen it come for him, and now all she could do was wait. The next night, Jenna fought sleep as long as she could. She turned the television on, let the hum of the infomercials fill the room, let the glow of the screen hold back the dark. She told herself she wouldn't look at the door. But some things demand to be seen. At 3:06 a.m., the TV cut to static. The volume warped, twisting into a deep, distorted hum. Jenna turned toward the screen, horror creeping into her bones as she saw her own reflection in the flickering light. Behind her, in the dimness of the hospital room, a shape stood at the foot of her bed. Tall, dark, waiting. She didn't remember screaming. The nurses later told her they had found her in the corner of the room, her knees pulled to her chest, eyes wild with terror. She hadn't spoken for nearly an hour, just sat there, whispering over and over again, "I'm next, I'm next." They moved her to another room after that, one closer to the nurses' station, one that didn't sit at the end of the hall where the shadow stretched longest. The next patient to occupy room 413 died within 2 nights. The nurses stopped talking about it. The doctors looked the other way, and when Miriam told me about Jenna that night, when she spoke about the way the woman had pleaded not to be left alone, I felt something heavy settle in my chest, because I knew what she wasn't saying, because I had seen it too, because I knew some things in hospitals aren't meant to be understood. Some things don't leave when you turn on the lights. Some things wait, and they always come back. Hospitals collect stories, the kind people don't talk about in the daylight, the kind that never make it into medical journals. They linger in whispers between nurses during the graveyard shift, passed along in hushed voices like warnings. I had tried to ignore them, chalk them up to overworked minds seeing what they wanted to see. But after Mr. Wallace, and after hearing about Jenna Barnes' shadow in room 413, I wasn't so sure anymore. And then I heard about Mr. Franklin. It came up over lunch with another former colleague, Daniel Lawson, a night nurse at Pinehaven Hospice Center in New Hampshire. Pinehaven wasn't a regular hospital, it was where people went to die. Patients were admitted there when medicine had given up on them, when all that was left was waiting. Daniel had worked there for over 15 years. He had seen death so many times it barely registered anymore. That's why, when he told me this story, the fact that his voice shook was what truly unsettled me. He knew, Daniel said. Mr. Franklin knew before it even happened. I asked him what he meant, and he took a long sip of his coffee before speaking. It had started like any other night. Daniel was making his rounds, checking on patients, adjusting IV drips, monitoring vitals. Mr. Franklin, 82 years old, had been in a coma for nearly a month after a devastating stroke. His family had stopped visiting weeks ago, and most of the staff saw him as just another bed to check, another silent body waiting for the inevitable. But that night, something changed. At 2:45 a.m., as Daniel entered room 212, he noticed something strange. Mr. Franklin was sitting up, not just awake, but alert, eyes wide open, staring directly at him. Daniel nearly dropped the clipboard. This wasn't possible. Mr. Franklin had been completely unresponsive for weeks. His vitals had been stable, but there was no sign that he would ever regain consciousness. "Mr. Franklin," Daniel said, stepping closer. "Can you hear me?" The old man's eyes were sharp, clearer than they should have been. His lips cracked apart, and when he spoke, his voice was nothing more than a whisper. "He's coming for me!" A chill ran through Daniel. "Who's coming, Mr. Franklin?" The old man blinked slowly, then turned his head toward the doorway. Daniel followed his gaze. There was nothing there. But the longer he stared, the more he felt a presence, a heaviness in the air, like the pressure in a room before a storm. It made his skin crawl. "Mr. Franklin," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "Who's coming?" The old man's breathing hitched. His fingers twitched against the blanket. Then, just as suddenly as he had woken up, his body slumped back against the pillows, eyes rolling shut. Daniel grabbed his wrist. His pulse was weak. He pressed the call button, calling for assistance, but even as he did, the sensation of being watched never left him. The doctor said it was probably a reflex, an involuntary last burst of neural activity before shutting down for good. Daniel didn't believe them. He had worked in hospice too long. He had seen patients wait holding on until a loved one arrived, until they heard a familiar voice one last time. The body could do strange things when it knew the end was near. But this felt different. At 3:30 a.m., Daniel decided to check on Mr. Franklin again. Something in his gut told him he needed to. As he stepped into the room, the first thing he noticed was the empty bed. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring. His mind struggled to make sense of it. Mr. Franklin couldn't have left on his own. Even if he had somehow regained full mobility, there were monitors attached to him, IVs in his arms, rails on the bed. The machines hadn't beeped. Nothing had alerted the nurses. He reached for his radio, his hands cold with sweat. "Mr. Franklin is missing," he said. There was a long silence before the reply. "What do you mean missing?" They checked the entire floor. Then the security team pulled up the cameras. And that's when Daniel's stomach dropped. At 3:17 a.m., the hallway camera showed a figure entering Mr. Franklin's room. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes, his face was turned away from the camera, shadowed, impossible to make out. Daniel's blood ran cold as he watched the footage. The figure moved smoothly, almost unnaturally, straight toward the bed. He bent down, did something unseen, and then lifted Mr. Franklin's frail body into a wheelchair. Then, without a single hesitation, he wheeled him out of the room and down the hall. Not one nurse saw him, not one alarm went off. The doors never triggered. The only reason they even knew something happened was because Mr. Franklin's bed was empty. For 3 full days, there was no sign of him. Then, the police found them. Mr. Franklin's son had been the man in the footage. He had taken his father to an old farmhouse miles away from the city, a place their family had once owned. When they found them, Mr. Franklin was still alive. Barely. He died 2 weeks later, just as his son had promised him years ago, not in a hospital bed, but in their family home. A part of Daniel wanted to believe that was all it was. A desperate son keeping a promise, but the way Mr. Franklin had spoken that night, the way he had known before it happened, and then there was the footage, the way his son had moved, the way he had known exactly where to go, exactly how to avoid being seen. Something about it felt too perfect, too planned. And there was one last thing. On the camera footage, at the very end, as Mr. Franklin's son wheeled him toward the exit, he finally turned his head toward the camera, just for a split second. But Daniel swore to me that his eyes weren't human anymore. And when the nurses reviewed the logs later, they found one more strange thing. At exactly 3:17 a.m., at the same moment the footage showed Mr. Franklin being taken, every single monitor on the floor flatlined, just for a moment, just long enough for something to slip through. Daniel finished his story with a deep breath, his fingers still clenched around his coffee cup. "I don't know what happened that night," he said, "but I know one thing. Mr. Franklin wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of something else." I didn't ask what he thought that was, because I already knew. Hospitals are full of ghosts. Not all of them are dead. Hospitals have a way of making you question reality. After hearing Daniel's story about Mr. Franklin, I couldn't stop thinking about what it meant, how some people seemed to know when their time was up, how certain places in hospitals felt like more than just empty rooms. I had always told myself that what I saw with Mr. Wallace was nothing more than a coincidence, that what happened to Jenna Barnes in room 413 was some strange trick of the mind. But when you hear stories like Daniel's, when you see the way his hands shook as he told it, you start to wonder. And then I met David Russo. David wasn't a doctor, wasn't a nurse. He was a security guard at St. Luke's Memorial Hospital in Texas, the kind of guy you'd expect to see standing outside a locked supply closet, checking his watch, waiting for his shift to end. But when he told me his story, there was something in his eyes He had seen something down in the morgue, and whatever it was, it knew his name. David had been working the night shift at St. Luke's for nearly 2 years. Hospitals at night were different from during the day. Emptier, lonelier. If something moved in the dark, you noticed. He had been assigned to patrol the basement level that night, which included the morgue. He hated it down there, but he tried not to let it get to him. It was just another room, just a place for the dead. But as he made his way down the empty corridor, his radio silent, his footsteps echoing off the tiled floor, something felt off. The bank felt off. The air was too cold. Not like the usual chill of a hospital AC system. This was different. It clung to his skin, seeped into his bones. Then he heard it. A whisper. "David!" He stopped dead in his tracks. The voice had come from inside the morgue. He exhaled slowly, told himself it was nothing. Probably just the vents, a trick of the air moving through the building. But then it came again. "David, please!" This time, it wasn't just a whisper, it was desperate. His hands tightened around the flashlight as he stepped toward the morgue door. The hospital had a strict protocol, no unauthorized personnel in the morgue, no exceptions. But as he reached for the handle, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The door was already open. Just an inch, just enough. He swallowed hard and pushed it open the rest of the way. The light inside was dim, but enough to see the metal gurneys. The cold storage drawers lining the far wall. Everything looked normal. Everything was exactly how it should be. But then, tap, 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 a soft, rhythmic tapping from the far end of the room. David swung his flashlight toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Tap, tap, tap. This time he saw where it was coming from, one of the storage drawers, the one at the very end. David felt every muscle in his body tighten. He had heard stories from other guards, whispers about this place, strange noises, cold spots, doors opening on their own. But he had never believed them, not until now. His radio crackled to life, making him nearly jump out of his skin. "Russo, what's your status?" He hesitated, his eyes locked on that drawer. "Basement's clear," he lied, his voice barely steady. He turned to leave, not willing to stay another second. Then something breathed on the back of his neck. He spun around, flashlight shaking in his grip. No one was there, but the drawer that had been tapping, it was now slightly open. His heart was hammering so loud he could barely think. He needed to get the hell out of there. He took one step back. The lights went out. The room was swallowed in darkness. And then he heard it again, right next to him. "David." It was a whisper, but this time it wasn't desperate. It was laughing. David ran. He didn't care about protocol, didn't care if his supervisor wrote him up for abandoning his post. He sprinted down the hall, the air thick with something unseen, his own breath coming out in ragged gasps. By the time he made it back to the main floor, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely press the button for the elevator. When he finally reached the security station, he didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring at the monitors, willing himself to believe it had been in his head. Then another guard walked in, an older guy named Mick, who had been working at St. Luke's for over 15 years. David must have still looked pale because Mick frowned at him. "You okay?" he asked. David hesitated. Then, before he could stop himself, he asked, "Have you ever heard anything? In the morgue?" Mick didn't even blink. "All the time," he said. David stared. "You're serious?" Mick just nodded, like it was nothing. "You hear whispers, knocking, sometimes even crying. The place is haunted as hell. No one likes going down there alone." He grabbed a coffee from the counter, taking a slow sip before adding, "But if you ever hear it say your name, that's when you run." David felt his stomach turn to ice. He didn't sleep that morning, he didn't go back down to the morgue, and from that night forward, whenever his shift required him to patrol the basement, he made sure he was never alone. But sometimes, when he walked past the elevator that led down to the morgue, he swore he could still hear it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. A whisper just barely audible over the sound of the hospital's hum. David. And sometimes, he thought he heard it laughing. Hospitals carry stories like scars. The longer you stay in one, the more you start to notice them. The strange echoes in empty hallways, the flickering lights in rooms that should be vacant, the whispers you tell yourself are just in your head. After hearing what happened to David Russo in the morgue, I had convinced myself that I'd heard the worst of them. But then I learned about room 315 at Riverview Psychiatric Hospital. It wasn't a regular hospital, it was a psychiatric facility. A place where patients were often written off, their stories dismissed as hallucinations or delusions. That's what made this one so much worse. Because when a nurse sees something, when security footage backs it up, you can't just explain it away. I heard about it from Emily Vaughn, a night nurse who had worked there for over 5 years. She wasn't the kind of person to scare easily. She had dealt with patients in the middle of psychotic breaks, walked into rooms where people had scrawled gibberish on the walls in their own blood. But when she told me about room 315, there was something in her voice, a kind of quiet, unsettled fear that I had only ever heard once before. When David told me about the thing in the morgue, Emily's shift had started like any other. She was making her rounds, checking patient charts, making sure the overnight staff had administered their meds. The halls were quiet, too quiet, with only the occasional distant murmur from a restless patient. At 2:30 a.m., she reached the 3rd floor. That's when she noticed something off. Room 315's door was open. That shouldn't have been possible. She checked her list. Room 315 had been empty for weeks. Maintenance had been scheduled to fix a leak in the ceiling, and no one had been inside since. Emily hesitated. The air coming from the room felt wrong, heavy, stagnant. She stepped inside. The light was dim, the flickering overhead bulb casting long shadows against the wall. At first, she thought the room was empty. Then she saw her. A frail, elderly woman sitting on the bed, her back turned to Emily. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The woman was too still. She didn't move, didn't flinch at the sound of Emily stepping closer. "Ma'am?" Emily's voice was careful, controlled. The woman didn't respond. Emily reached for her radio, ready to call security. Patients didn't just appear in empty rooms. Then the woman spoke. "He took them." Emily froze. The woman's voice was barely a whisper, like air being pushed through brittle lungs. Emily swallowed hard. "Who took them?" The woman's head turned, just slightly. "He took them all." Emily's blood ran cold. Something about the way she spoke, the finality in her voice made every hair on Emily's arm stand on end. She took a slow step back, gripping her radio. "I'm going to call someone, okay? Just stay here." The woman didn't react. Emily turned toward the door, stepping into the hallway, pressing the radio button. Static. She frowned, adjusting the dial. "This is Vaughn. I need someone on the 3rd floor, room 315. Nothing. She cursed under her breath and turned back to the room. The bed was empty. The woman was gone. Emily's breath hitched. She scanned the room, her pulse hammering. The chair by the window was empty. The closet door was open. Nothing inside. There was nowhere she could have gone. Emily ran to the nurse's station, practically crashing into one of the night staff. "Room 315, she gasped. "Did anyone move a patient in there?" The nurse gave her a confused look. "What? No, that room's been empty for weeks." Emily shook her head. "I just saw a woman in there. Old, frail, white hair. She was sitting on the bed." The nurse's expression darkened. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking," Emily snapped. The nurse didn't blink. "Room 315 hasn't had a patient in a long time." Emily pulled in a sharp breath. "Then who the hell was that?" "They checked the security footage." Emily stood next to the security officer as the grainy black and white recording played. The timestamp read 2:32 a.m., just as she had stepped into the room. She watched herself walk inside. watched herself freeze, watched herself step back, reaching for her radio. She felt her stomach knot. The angle was clear. She could see the entire room. There was no one there, no elderly woman, no frail figure sitting on the bed. Emily stared at the screen, her breath shallow. "I saw her," she whispered. The security officer said nothing. She turned to him, trying to push down the rising nausea in her gut. "Play the footage from last night." He hesitated, then rewound the tape. Emily watched in stunned silence as, at exactly 2:32 a.m., the door to room 315 creaked open, on its own. And then, for just a split second, a shadow passed across the screen. Not a patient, not a nurse, something else. Emily didn't sleep that morning. She went back through the patient records, searching for anyone who might have fit the description of the woman she had seen. And then she found it. 10 years ago, a woman named Eleanor Hayes had been a long-term patient in room 315. She had suffered from dementia and paranoia, often telling staff that he's coming for them and he took them all. One night she vanished. The hospital ruled it as an escape, but no one knew how she got out. No one ever found her. Emily sat back, her skin clammy. The last thing Eleanor Hayes had written in her patient notes, scrawled in shaky, jagged handwriting, was a single sentence. "He took them all. Now he's waiting for me." That night, Emily refused to step onto the third floor. And to this day, room 315 at Riverview Psychiatric remains empty, because every time they try to admit someone new, the door opens by itself. Hospitals have their secrets. I learned that much after hearing Emily Vaughn's story about room 315 at Riverview Psychiatric. Some things defied explanation, no matter how much we tried to rationalize them, and once you've heard enough of these stories, you start to wonder if hospitals aren't just places where people come to get better or die, but places where something else lingers. That's what led me to Holloway Medical Center in Chicago. I had been speaking to a friend who worked in hospital maintenance when I mentioned the story about room 3015. He nodded slowly, as if considering something, then leaned in and asked, "Have you ever heard about the 7th floor at Holloway?" I told him I hadn't. He took a slow sip of his coffee and said, "Then let me tell you about Mark Reynolds." Mark had worked as a maintenance technician at Holloway for over a decade. He had seen everything: malfunctioning machines, flickering lights, pipes that groaned like dying animals. But the elevator issue was something different. It had started 2 months prior. The staff elevator, the one that only doctors, nurses, and maintenance used, began stopping on the 7th floor by itself. At first, they thought it was a glitch. Problem was, the 7th floor was closed, had been for years. A fire had gutted the entire floor back in 1998. It had never been repaired. The damage had been too extensive, and rather than renovate, the hospital had just sealed it off. Mark had been the first to check it out. One night, after getting another complaint from staff about the elevator doors opening onto the empty floor, he decided to go up and inspect it himself. It was just a floor, he told himself. He rode the elevator up, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as the numbers ticked higher. When the doors slid open, he stepped out into the dark. The air was thick with dust. The ceiling panels sagged, the walls were charred black from old smoke damage. But something else was wrong. It was too cold. Not the kind of chill from a faulty AC unit, something deeper. Mark stepped forward cautiously, his work boots scuffing against the grimy tile floor. The emergency lights were still functional, casting long, weak shadows down the hall. He walked toward the old nurses' station, the place where the fire had started all those years ago. As he moved, the silence pressed against him. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, not moving, not speaking, just watching. Mark stopped cold. His flashlight trembled slightly in his grip. "Hello?" His voice echoed in the empty hall. No response. The figure shifted forward. Mark's stomach twisted. The emergency lights flickered. For a moment, just a split second, he saw its face. It wasn't right. The eyes were black. The mouth was stretched too wide. Then the lights blinked out completely. Mark turned and ran. He hit the elevator button over and over, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The doors didn't close fast enough. Just before they shut, he saw the figure standing inches away, its empty eyes locked onto him. Then the doors slammed shut, and he was plunged into darkness. Mark never went back up there. Neither did anyone else. But the elevator kept stopping on the 7th floor. Sometimes, when a nurse or doctor was riding alone, the doors would slide open, revealing the pitch-black hallway beyond. Sometimes they swore they saw someone standing just beyond the doors, and sometimes, only sometimes. When the doors closed again, a single handprint would be left behind on the metal, small, smudged with soot, like someone who had never made it out. Mark put in a request to shut down the staff elevator permanently, but the hospital refused. Too much money, too much hassle. So instead, Mark made a rule for himself: never take the elevator alone, and never ride it after midnight. Because once, at exactly 12:07 a.m., he had been working late and made the mistake of riding it down by himself. And when the doors opened on the 7th floor, the emergency lights were already on, and this time the figure wasn't at the end of the hall, it was standing inside the elevator. Waiting. Hospitals are places of healing, of life, of medicine and science. But if these stories have taught us anything, it's that they are also thresholds, places where the boundaries between life and death, the known and the unknown, begin to blur. Each of these stories carries a warning. Not just about the supernatural, but about the things we often ignore. The whispers in the morgue, the shadows in the hallway, the unspoken fears of patients who seem to know too much. Maybe they are just tricks of the mind, products of exhaustion and overactive imagination, but maybe, just maybe, they are something more. 1. Always listen to those who are close to the end. Mr. Wallace and Mr. Franklin both knew something before it happened. Was it coincidence, or were they sensing something we couldn't? Dismissing the dying as confused or delusional may mean ignoring something far more significant. 2. Trust your instincts. Jenna Barnes knew something was wrong before she ever saw the shadow in room 413 at Emily Vaughn. Felt the unease in room 315 before she even stepped inside. When something feels off, listen to that feeling. It might just save you. 3. Hospitals. Don't forget, some places hold on to the past. Whether it's the burned-out 7th floor at Holloway Medical Center or the cold drawers in the morgue at St. Luke's, some events leave a mark, one that lingers long after everyone else has moved on. 4. The dead are not always silent. David Russo heard his name whispered in the morgue. Was it just exhaustion, or was something trying to reach him? The next time you hear an unexplained noise in an empty room, ask yourself, is it just in your head, or is someone trying to be heard? 5. Some doors are better left closed. Emily made the mistake of stepping into room 315. Mark let the elevator doors open on the 7th floor. Sometimes curiosity is an invitation to something you don't understand. If you find yourself in a hospital late at night and a door creaks open on its own, don't go inside. These stories aren't just meant to scare you, they're meant to remind you that the world is full of things we don't fully understand. Science can explain a lot, but it can't explain everything. There are still shadows we haven't uncovered, still voices whispering just out of reach. So whether you work the night shift at a hospital, find yourself recovering in a dimly lit room, or simply take the wrong elevator at the wrong time, stay aware, pay attention to the things others ignore. And most importantly, never assume you're alone. Thank you for listening to these stories. If you've ever experienced something unexplainable, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. And if you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next story might just be yours. Stay safe, stay aware, and as always, watch the shadows.